All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. So today is the class is called "Does God Change His Mind?" So in this week's Torah portion, the one we read yesterday called Va'era, and the one coming up this week, which is called Bo, we are of course talking about the whole story of the Exodus of Egypt. And in last week's Torah portion, we read the first seven plagues. And in this coming Torah portion, we are going to read the last three plagues and kind of the end of the slavery and eventually the Jewish people leave. But if you kind of take a wider look at the whole Egyptian slavery, which of course is then going to give us insight into how this world works, you notice that the first time Hashem introduced the concept of slavery was with Abraham. Do you know that? Way before the Jewish people were in Egypt, when God was making a covenant with Abraham. So the Torah tells us that God made Abraham fall into a deep sleep. And this was kind of Hashem revealing himself to Abraham. This was part of the covenant. And a great darkness fell over Abraham. And the Torah tells us that God said to Abraham, you should know that your descendants will be strangers in a land that's not theirs. And God told him for how long it's going to be. Hashem said 400 years. And Hashem said they're going to be enslaved and they're going to be mistreated. But Hashem said, don't worry. Well, he didn't say don't worry. He said, but I will punish the nation that enslaves them. And afterwards, they're going to go out with great wealth. Right? So right now, Abraham lives in Israel and nobody's anywhere near Egypt. What happens? 3 generations later, so Abraham, not Abraham, but Yitzchak, not Yitzchak, his son, not Jacob, goes down to Egypt, and the generations following that eventually land up being enslaved, obviously. And like you all know, the Egyptians made the Jewish people slaves. And then Hashem fulfilled his promise that he took the Jewish people out, and he took us out with great wealth. And that's also why it says in the Torah that the Jewish people were in this long slavery. At some point, the king of Egypt died. And it says that the Jewish people at that point had an opportunity to cry out to Hashem. So they started to cry out to Hashem from their slavery. The Torah says that God heard their groaning, and God remembered the covenant that he had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because he had made the covenant with Abraham that the Jewish people would be slaves, but also the covenant was that the Jewish people would eventually go out of slavery. So that's also why when Hashem spoke to Moshe, God spoke to Moshe and he said, I want you to go to Pharaoh, because I have hardened his heart, as we spoke about a lot yesterday, and you're going to perform miracles and signs. And Hashem said, so that in order that you tell your children and your grandchildren that Hashem has made a mockery of the Egyptians and how Hashem performed wonders and miracles for all of the Egyptians. And Hashem, showed them basically who's boss. So that's the story that everybody knows, right? Hashem told Abraham that your descendants would be slaves. Jewish people were slaves. Hashem, at some point, the Jewish people cry out. God says, I remember the covenant that I made with Abraham. Sends Moshe, punishes the Egyptians, and takes the Jewish people out. Yes? Yes. Thank you.
So, knowing what they knew, when Jacob went down to Egypt, it was voluntary. It was to see Joseph.
Yeah.
He didn't have to go. He could have said, "Hey, I remember hearing a story from my grandfather about, maybe it's not a good idea to go there."
Yeah.
He wasn't captured and taken into slavery.
So we did speak about that a lot, and it says in the commentaries that if Jacob would not have gone down willingly, God would have somehow forced him down. Or in a sense, God did force him down because God sent Joseph ahead of him. Interestingly, that when Hashem told Abraham, your descendants will be slaves, he said 400 years, which the Jewish people were not in Egypt for 400 years. The Jewish people spent 210 years in Egypt. And the count is that there's 400 years from the birth of Isaac till the exodus of Egypt. That's where there's 400 years. But the Jewish people were actually in Egypt for 210 years, of which 80 of those years were slavery. So they were not slaves for 400 years. They were in Egypt for 210, and they were slaves for 80 of those years. Anyway, so once you take this whole picture into consideration, the Rebbe, as he always did, kind of really cuts down to the bottom of it. And the Rebbe says as follows. He says, we know that everybody is given free choice. That's a core belief that we have in Judaism, that everybody has free choice. Your choice is if you want to follow the path of good or if you want to, do the opposite. And the Rambam writes that a person should not entertain the notion of fools that when a person is born, God decrees whether this person is going to be good or bad, right? Because there's been many suggestions that we don't really have free choice. So the Rambam Maimonides says absolutely not. Every person has free choice. You can either choose to be as righteous as Moses or as wicked as a man called Yerovam, who was known to be an evil person, right? You can choose to be wise or foolish, kind or cruel. You can choose to be miserly or generous. Nobody can force you. Nobody's forcing anybody. There's no decree upon him or her that will force him in any specific direction. Every person has the ability to choose which way they're going to go. And therefore, what's the obvious outcome of that? Everybody is making choices. A sinner is responsible for their sins and going to be punished for it. And they're responsible for what they do to their soul. And a good person that does good is rewarded for the good that they do, because every person has choice, right? So it's a mathematical equation, very simple. If you have free choice, you get punished. If you didn't have free choice, then why would you get punished? So the free choice is what allows there to be the concept of punishment, right? If we lived in a reality where God decreed, hey, this person's going to be evil, or this person's going to be good, then what would the punishment and reward be? And in the Torah, especially by the prophets, you have all the time. The prophets continuously, if you read through the prophets of the Torah, it's always, if you do good, then you'll get rewarded. And if you don't mend your ways, then God is going to punish a person. And then what would be the whole point of having a prophet to come to tell us to do good or to do bad if anyway Hashem has decided, so which way we're going to go? In other words, Judaism believes that every person has free choice, and therefore there's punishment and reward. Because if you didn't have free choice, then why would God punish a bad person for doing bad if that person didn't have choice? Rather, the explanation is that every person has choice, nobody's forced, and therefore person gets punished for the bad choices that they make, or person gets rewarded for the good choices that they make. So then the Rebbe said, so the kicker of all questions is, how could Hashem punish the Egyptians? Why not? Because God already decreed hundreds of years earlier, right? When God and Abraham were making a covenant, Hashem said to him, your descendants are going to be enslaved in the land of Egypt and then I'm going to punish the Egyptians and take the Jewish people out with great wealth. So why is that fair on the Egyptians? Everything was already destined and planned for them. God planned already that they were going to be evil. He planned that they were going to do bad. And then he said, I'm going to punish them. But the Egyptians don't deserve a punishment. Seemingly, they are just carrying out the work of Hashem. But Abraham lived, this covenant with Abraham was 190 years before the Jewish people even went down to Egypt. So 190 years earlier, before the Jewish people went down to Egypt, God already prophesied, or God already told Abraham the prophet, that the Jewish people will be enslaved and tormented in Egypt, and I'm going to punish the Egyptians. So the Rebbe is asking a very obvious question, which I think we've spoken about many times, which is, how do you punish the Egyptians for fulfilling a prophecy, the announcement of Hashem? God said that they would do evil. So how can you punish them? They're just fulfilling what God said. We just finished saying that the only reason why bad people get punished is because they have free choice, and good people get rewarded because they have free choice. But in this case, it seems that they didn't have choice because God already said what would happen. What do you think?
Did this apply to everyone? Maybe he says that they'll happen to bad people, but are there groups of good people that it doesn't happen to in the future? Or
Are you asking specifically about the Egyptians or in general?
in general, it's saying
In
if they don't,
general, a person gets rewarded for the good that they do, and the bad, they get punished for the bad that they do, because everybody has free choice. But it seems like that the Egyptians weren't given free choice. Where's the free choice of the Egyptians? God already said 190 years earlier, he told Abraham. Abraham didn't live in Egypt, right? Abraham lived before the Pharaoh even lived. Nobody was even alive at that point. But God said, I want you to know that in the future, the Egyptians are going to enslave your people. So what kind of choice did the Egyptians have? God already said that it was going to happen. He put it all into place.
I guess what I'm asking is that all Egyptians, when God put this into place, or are there good
So
Egyptians
the
also?
Rambam, Maimonides, answers, I think what you're trying to say. And he says as follows. He said, God said that the Egyptians would enslave the Jewish people. But theoretically, each Egyptian still had a choice. That's what the Rambam writes. God didn't decree which specific Egyptian was going to enslave the Jewish people. He said to Abraham that the Egyptians at large would land up oppressing the Jewish people. I'll read you Maimonides' words. He says, the individual Egyptian tormenting the Jews had the choice not to, because God didn't decree that any specific Egyptian enslaved the Jews. Rather, God informed Abraham that his descendants would ultimately be enslaved in a land that was not theirs. So Maimonides wants to say, the Rambam wants to say that it wasn't each specific Egyptian had free choice. He could have bowed out of this terrible decree. He could have said, okay, I'm not part of the tormentors. The problem with that answer is that if you think about it, it doesn't work 100%. Why not? Because then theoretically, every Egyptian could have said, hey, not me. And then what? And then there wouldn't have been any tormentors, but God already did. In other words, how does the answer make sense? Hashem already told Abraham that your descendants will be enslaved by the Egyptians. So our question was, so hey, where's the free choice? And if they didn't have free choice, how could you punish them? The Rambam answers, each individual Egyptian could have bowed out, could have chosen not to. But then how does that make sense? Because that's not true. If every Egyptian had free choice, and if every Egyptian would have decided not to, then there wouldn't have been anybody to fulfill God's plan, and that would never work. God's plan is God's plan, which this question is not mine. There's a famous commentary, very interesting, by a man called the Ravid. That's an acronym. And the Ravid, he wrote his commentary into the book of the Rambam. They lived at a similar time period, or their lives overlapped. And basically, when the Rambam wrote his work, he kind of wrote notes into the Rambam's work. In fact, many, many times that they print the Rambam with the Ravid's notes. And very often he argues with the Rambam. So you'll have the Rambam, and then it will have a side note, like side note, Ravid, question on. So the Ravid says, I'll read you his question. He said, how can it be said that for every individual Egyptian, that every individual had free choice, and God did not decree about any of them that they would participate in the oppression of the Jews? God had decreed that the Jews would be oppressed. So one of them would end up implementing the decree, right? If somebody's going to implement the decree. So if you say every Egyptian had the ability to bow out, that can't possibly be true. The Rambam, Maimonides, is suggesting that God did not force any particular Egyptian to participate in this. The Ravid said, what does that mean? That's not true. How could that possibly be? So then if every Egyptian would have chosen not to, then who would have been there to fulfill God's decree? Must be that at least some Egyptian, so to say, is being forced by Hashem, in which case we go back to our original question, how can you punish them? Right? According to the Rambam, every private citizen could have had a choice. But then the Ravid asks, 1 second. So imagine every Egyptian would have chosen not to say, okay, no, I'm not doing it. And there would not have been anybody to fulfill Hashem's decree.
Is it realistic to think that the Egyptians would defy the Pharaoh because they thought of him
it's
as
not
their
realistic,
God?
but it's not realistic to think that. But in general, when it comes to this idea that every person has free choice, we're not suggesting that it's easy. A lot of people are raised in difficult circumstances. So the free choice doesn't mean that it's easy to make the right choice. It means that you have the ability to. Or name. And the Rebbe says that the Ravid's question on the Rambam goes even a step further. Why? Because he says that regarding Pharaoh himself, the question is even stronger. Because what do you want to argue? That Pharaoh had free choice and Pharaoh could have said no, right? According to the Rambam, why is God punishing the Egyptians? Because every individual Egyptian has free choice. God decreed that the Egyptian as a whole would enslave the Jewish people, but not a specific Egyptian. Give me 1 second.
So,
Hello?
good point. Hello.
You can make yourself some space with it, don't be shy.
Oh, I'm fine. Got lots of space. Okay.
So,
Oh, you have to share it with us.
how did the Pharaoh have power over the Egyptians? It's not like they elected him. They said, okay, we voted for this guy and we're going to follow his policies.
I don't know.
So when you say I'm just trying to see what the leverage is for that to happen.
Yeah. We'll just fill you in. So what we're discussing is that in this whole story of the Egyptian exile, Hashem already told Abraham, which Abraham lived like 200 years before the story of the exile in Egypt. God already told Abraham that his descendants one day would be slaves in Egypt. This was already, so to say, predestined. So then we ask the obvious question, which is, then why is it fair to punish the Egyptians? The only time you can punish somebody is if they have choice. Or you can reward somebody if they have choice. And it's a core belief in Judaism that every person does have choice, whether they're going to be good or bad. No, but you can't make maybe more difficult for one or easier for other, but everybody ultimately has the choice to be kind, mean, miserly, generous. You get to choose how you behave, and therefore you get rewarded. But if Hashem already told Abraham and said, hey, in 200 years, your descendants are going to be enslaved and the Egyptians are going to enslave them. So why is it fair to punish the Egyptians? What did the Egyptians do wrong? Okay. Right? What did the Egyptians do wrong? Wasn't it, they were just fulfilling the destiny that Hashem had in store for them. That question makes sense? If God already planned that the Egyptians would enslave the Jewish people, so what are you punishing the Egyptians for? They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't choose. They just fulfilled God's plan.
So why did he?
That's the question. So one answer that Maimonides, the Rambam, suggests is that every individual Egyptian had a choice. In other words, God had destined, God had planned that the Egyptians as a whole, somebody from the Egyptian nation would enslave the Jewish people. But each particular Egyptian could have bowed out. Right? On an individual level, that you all had choice. That's the Rambam. The Raavad, another commentary, argues with the Rambam, and he says that's not a good answer. Because then theoretically, if every single Egyptian would have chosen not to, who would have been there to fulfill God's plan? So if you're telling me that every individual had choice, that theory will run out, because then if every Egyptian says, hey, not me, not me, not me, not me, then who will be there to fulfill God's plan? And the question is even stronger for Pharaoh himself. How can God, imagine the Pharaoh would have bowed out. In other words, did Pharaoh himself have free choice? What are you going to say? That Pharaoh could have chosen not to enslave the Jewish people? And then who would have enslaved the Jewish people? Different person? Right? In addition, this question is even stronger regarding Pharaoh himself. In order for the Egyptians to enslave the Jewish people, Pharaoh's consent was required because he was the all-powerful ruler. Historically, it did happen that way. Pharaoh told his people, right, that was the story. It was Pharaoh who instigated the slavery to begin with. Therefore, even if we are to say, like the Rambam, Maimonides wants to say, that there was no divine decree on each individual Egyptian that they have to take part in the oppression, Pharaoh's role, Pharaoh himself, his role, seemingly seems to be preordained. So that's our question. Our question is that seemingly this whole thing is set up. It's a setup. It's preordained. Hundreds of years before the Jews even stepped foot in Egypt, God already told Abraham that the Egyptians are going to enslave the Jewish people. So along come the Egyptians and enslave the Jewish people. And what are you blaming them for? What did they do wrong? They're just carrying out God's mission.
Does it have anything to do with it that God said they were going to be in slavery for 400 years, which was actually 5 times greater than what it was?
It's not the answer that we're going to give today, but I think that is one of the famous answers, which is that they got punished because they did it in a way that was much worse than God had, so to say, prophesied. Like, even if God had preordained that the Egyptians would have enslaved the Jewish people, there's slavery and then there's slavery. You can get by showing up from 9 to 5 and doing the haphazard, or you can really take enjoyment and pleasure in making other people suffer. So the punishment was for the extra. It is an answer that to some degree it was preordained that they would be suffering in slavery, but the Egyptians went like all out, much more. That definitely is a potential answer. Before we do the answers, the question making sense? Obviously, it can have much bigger ramifications, which is, how much is Hashem controlling and how much is Hashem not controlling? What's within our ability of choice, what's not? But one thing for sure, the Rambam Maimonides is adamant that the fundamental of Jewish faith is that every person has free choice to be a good or bad person. Which, by the way, doesn't mean that other things you necessarily have choice about. Not everything a person has to do. We don't get to choose how long we live. We don't get to choose how healthy we are. Right? We don't get to choose what kind of family we have. The ability to have choice the ability to choose is specifically within the realm of good or bad. Not everything is up for a person's choice. There's obviously some involvement and some investment from Hashem. You didn't get to choose in which generation you were born. You didn't get to choose to which parents you were born. Although maybe your soul had some it's interesting. So Mushki's parents were here for Shabbos, as you both know. So on yesterday in the afternoon, they were just sitting around and schmoozing. So Mushki's mother, she called over one of my kids, and she said to him, from a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being the worst, 10 being amazing, how good is your life?
To who?
To my kids. It was
They asked the conversation. They asked the kids to come.
my mother-in-law, the grandmother, asked the kids, what was the bigger conversation? But the point I want to say, she asked them, she said, if you can change one thing in your life, what would it be?
Oh, what'd they say?
Well, I know what Zalman's answer would be. That
What?
he would be born first.
But it was an interest.
What was the answer?
There wasn't that's kind of the point, that they almost struggled to find, the answer, because
They don't know what they could have as opposed to what they have.
no, I think they were smart enough not to say that, another toy would that's not what it's about. So ultimately, what's the answer to that question? If you can have one thing that would started going for very non-personal answers, such as world peace and those kinds of things. But on a personal level, if you can have one thing, why am I bringing this up? Is because we're not suggesting that a person has choice on every level, right? The order that you're born in the family, you don't get to choose. There's a lot of things that a person doesn't necessarily control, doesn't have choice. And, I don't know if we would be able to choose everything. We're not smart enough to line that, at some point. It's like, well, if you're going to take this one thing, then you're going to lose another thing. Like, the life is life to some degree. Of course, we all have things that we want to change. But choice that we do have is more on the level of good and evil, or, to follow Hashem or not to follow Hashem. That's where we have choice. So the question becomes with the Egyptians is, why is God punishing Pharaoh and the Egyptians if this was pre-planned? The Jewish people knew, to your point about Jacob, they knew that they were going to land up in Egypt, and they knew that they would be redeemed, and they knew that they would be enslaved. So why does Pharaoh deserve to be punished? If anything, he should be rewarded. He's carrying out the will of Hashem.
Rewarded.
He's carrying out the will of God. God chose him, right? So we could have different answers. Maybe he did it too much, or it could have been somebody else. But at the end of the day, there seems to be a big question. Is he not just carrying out the will of God? It's recorded in the Torah. God said to Abraham, when they made the covenant between God and Abraham, he said, your descendants will be slaves and tormented, and I will redeem them and punish the nation that torments them, and I will take them out with great wealth. So what did Pharaoh do wrong?
What would have happened if they didn't do that?
Right?
Could have changed their mind. I mean, but God saw that, I guess.
If the Jewish people wouldn't, or if the Egyptians would not have.
What if they just said, I don't feel like, no.
Right, that's the point. So it seems like the Egyptians couldn't. They didn't have the ability. God twisted his hand because, and how did God twist their hand? By making the declaration that he made 200 years earlier. Right? What would have happened if the Egyptians would have been like, no, we're not bad people, we're good people, we don't want to do this, why should we do this? And we're out, we're not enslaving the Jewish people. Then what God said would happen would not have happened, which can't be. If God says something, it's going to happen. I mean, his word kind of creates the destiny. And Maimonides suggests that he said, well, each individual Egyptian could have, chosen not to be a part of the slavery. And then our question, the Rabbit asks on that, well, that can't be true, because then if every single Egyptian would have chosen not to be involved, specifically the Pharaoh then there wouldn't have been any slavery at all. So,
Did God punish the one? I'm sure there were some that really didn't do anything, right? Because humans, you don't get 100% of anything. So what happened to say the 5, 10% that, yeah, I hear it, but I'm gonna do my own thing. There's a lot of us. Who's gonna know?
yeah, I don't know exactly, but they definitely suffered to some degree because Egypt was whacked with so many plagues. So
So they suffered, not,
definitely on a collective level.
Yeah.
It does say in yesterday's Torah portion clearly, by the way, that at some point Moses warned Pharaoh and he told him that any of the animals that are in the field are going to be, are going to be killed. And it says in the Torah yesterday that the Egyptians that had learned to fear God brought their animals and their slaves and they brought everything inside. Because when they heard that, Moses had already proven his track record, he was blood and frogs and punches, they were getting whacked. So some of the Egyptians, the Torah says, had already learned their lesson to fear God and they brought their stuff in from the fields, while others, had still not learned to fear God. They said, it doesn't matter. Or even towards the end, by the way, like into this Torah portion that's coming up this week, Moses told Pharaoh that all of the firstborns are going to be killed. And we're told that the firstborns banded together and they came to Pharaoh and they said, hey, if you don't let the Jewish people go, we're going to die. And we don't want to die. And it's not like Moses is messing around because he already has a proven track record. And Pharaoh said, I'm not willing to let them go. And there was a civil war. One of the real breaking points of the Egyptian exile was that civil war where the firstborns banded together and they tried to overthrow the Pharaoh. And they said, hey, you need to let the Jewish people go. Otherwise, we're all going to be killed. And we mention it in multiple places where it says that God struck the Egyptians with their own firstborns. It's part of the Saturday morning prayer. We say, Lamake Mitzrayim bivchorehem, which could have multiple meanings. One meaning could be that he just killed all the firstborns, but the other interpretation is that he used the firstborns themselves to weaken Egypt because the firstborns themselves revolted against the Pharaoh. And they said, hey, enough is enough. And to take your point even further, when the Jewish people did eventually leave Egypt, there was a group of Egyptians that left with the Jewish people. They said, hey, we've come to appreciate that God is God and that the ways of the Egyptians are wrong. And they joined the Jewish people. They converted to Judaism when the Jewish people left. Don't know how many. I don't know if it was 5, 10, 15, 20,000, 100,000. I'm sure the information is available somewhere, but there is definitely a group of Egyptians that joined the Jewish people and became converts.
So when, the sequence on the plagues was the plague, as you mentioned yesterday, that Moses would say that this is what's going to happen. And then it happened. And then there's a 3-week break and everything. So was there a time in between when Moses said the firstborn is going to be killed before it actually happened?
Yeah, because which is also this is also this week's Torah portion. At that point, everything started to change because Moses, after the 9th plague, he really started preparing the Jewish people to leave Egypt. First of all, he started giving instructions to the Jewish people. First of all, every Jew had to have a circumcision at that point. Number one. Number two is they started a calendar. They started a Jewish calendar. So they declared, with the birth of the new moon, they declared the new month. Then Moses instructed every Jew to go out and get a sheep. And you tied the sheep to your bedpost, for a couple of days. And they were told that on a certain night, you are to sacrifice the animal and to put the blood on the doorpost and to stay indoors because God is going to kill all the first ones. So there was and that's 2 weeks after they declared the beginning of the first of the month. So at this point, the Jews were basically operating as an independent people, completely not paying attention to anything that the Egyptians had to say. They basically were, getting ready. Not only that, even more. During the plague of darkness, the Jewish people were told to go and create a list of the Egyptian assets. Did you know that? Because when they left Egypt, Hashem specifically instructed them to take as much wealth as they could out of Egypt. Gold, silver, whatever they could get their hands on. So during the plague of darkness, they started to put together a list. It was like tax season, you know. They started collecting a list of the assets of the Egyptian people. And every family was to go and get as much wealth as they could from the Egyptian neighbors. So leading up to the plague of the firstborns, like at that point, the Jewish people, their whole attitude had changed. They were kind of, you know, the boss at this point. They were running their own show and they were getting ready to leave. They knew what was coming. Everybody knew what was coming. They prepared a sacrifice. They were ready to leave Egypt. When they made that sacrifice, they were instructed, have your luggage ready, you know, like you have to be ready to go. So it wasn't, and by the time midnight came and all of the firstborns were struck dead. In fact, Pharaoh came to Moses and said, leave now. And Moses said, no, we're not leaving in the middle of the night. Like thieves, we'll go in the morning. So morning came the day after because the first ones were all killed at midnight. The next morning, whatever, you know, sunrise, then the Jewish people left.
So you said Moses created the calendar.
Well, under Hashem's guidance, he instructed the Jewish people to well, it's not so much that he created the calendar because the calendar is created by the moon.
That's what I was going to ask you, because I was going to ask you if he created the calendar, how did they measure time beforehand?
Yeah, so it's not that he created the calendar, it's that he gave the Jewish people the instruction to sanctify the count, to, you know, to formalize and kind of set this plan in motion where they would make it a more of a religious ceremony, that today is the beginning of the month and start counting, so on and so forth. I'm not sure the answer to that question of what kind of calendar they were keeping before. Were they keeping a lunar calendar, a solar calendar? I don't know exactly, but it's not that they created a calendar, just because you're taking note of a physical phenomena.
It probably had something to do with the agricultural part.
But the calendar that Moses made was the Jewish people had to convene a court, and they had to declare that today, you know, they had to make sure that the new moon was seen and declare that today is the new month and make today's a holy day because it's the beginning of the month. And today we start counting 1 and 2 and so on. And that month became the first month. In other words, who decides what's the first and what's the second month? So while they were still in Egypt, they said, today's the first day of the first month. And the count of months started from there. New nation, new calendar. Because theoretically, what's the first and what's the last month? There is no first and last. You can count any month as the first. It doesn't make a difference, right? It's just a rotation. So
yeah, it's like Rosh Hashanah is not the first month.
Right. So that's the calendar that they were keeping until then. They were keeping the calendar based on the creation of the world. All right. So let's get back to what we were talking about before, which is this question of how can God punish the Egyptians for something that he himself said they would do? So when the Rebbe discussed this question, he began by first talking about the whole concept of prophecy in general. So throughout the generations of the Jewish people, there was a lot of prophets, and the prophets would say a lot of things. So when a prophet says something, the question is that definite destiny? If a prophet gets up and says, A, B, and C is going to happen, does it have to happen? Because the prophet is speaking in the name of God. So, or can our choice change those realities? So here again, the Rebbe quotes Maimonides, and he says as follows, that a prophet who arises, a prophet stands up and says, God sent him. I get up and I say, I'm a prophet, God sent me. So how do we know if I'm a real prophet or not? He does not have to perform a sign or a miracle that changes nature. I don't have to start turning water into blood or, you know, doing walk on water, any of those things. The only sign he must perform is I have to tell the future. If I'm to be a true prophet, so I have to say something that will happen in the future, and then we wait to see if what I say comes true or not. If it was even slightly inaccurate, we know that it's a false prophet. But if it all came to be true, then this person is to be trusted. With one exception. If a prophet stands up and he says he prophesizes about doom, says this year there's going to be a war. the whole year, right? He says, you're all not following in the ways of God properly, and God is going to punish us. It's going to be a war this year. And the whole year passes by, and there's no war. So that doesn't necessarily mean that he is a bad prophet, that he's a false prophet. Why? Because it's possible, the Rambam says, that when he made the prophecy, God wanted to punish the people. But then the people repented. They changed their ways. They did good. They made better choices. So Hashem, in his infinite mercy, so to say, forgave the Jewish people. And we have a few of those famous stories. You know the story of Jonah and the whale? What's the story of Jonah and the whale? God says to Jonah, go to Nineveh and tell them that I'm going to destroy the whole city. But the city never got destroyed because the message was that if you, right, it doesn't mean Jonah was a false prophet. He was a real prophet. But the idea was God said, I'm going to destroy the city if you don't behave. But if you do behave, then God would, it's not that God is changing his mind, then God has no reason to punish the Jewish people. If, however, the other way, what happens if a prophet says this year is going to be a good year, and he prophesies something good, right? He says that next month there's going to be a lot of rain, and the whole month goes by and there's no rain at all. So now we assume that he's a false prophet because he said that something would happen, but maybe you can make the opposite argument. You can say, well, the Jewish people weren't behaving, so God said they would be good, but now God took away the good that was coming because we misbehaved. So that we say is not true. So again, if he prophesies about something bad that's going to happen and it doesn't happen, it's still possible that he's a good prophet, that he's not a false prophet, that he's a true prophet, because God planned the punishment, but then took it back. But if the other way around, if he says something good's going to happen and then that good doesn't happen, he's for sure a false prophet. Why? Because he said, the Rambam says, Maimonides says, if the prophet gets up and says good thing will happen, and then it didn't materialize, we know for sure that he's a false prophet. Why? Because any good that God promises, even conditionally, will come to pass. God promises good, even conditionally, it's going to come to happen. This shows us that a prophet can only be validated with positive predictions. So you can never validate a prophet through a negative prediction, because then you could say, well, the Jewish people repented, so God took it away. But a positive prediction, God will never take away a positive prediction. And the same Rambam, he proves his point with a very interesting story in the Torah where the prophet gave a prophecy about something bad that would happen, but it didn't end up happening. What's the story? Do you know the story of Jeremiah and Hananiah? Here's the story. It's a story that happened in the end of towards the end of the first temple period, right? So the Jews are living in Israel, first temple stands, and it's towards the end of the first temple. And at that time, there was a lot of trouble in Israel because the Babylonians had taken over Israel. And they had captured Jerusalem, and they had taken with them thousands of Jewish captives. And then you had the Babylonians, they basically looted all the gold and the silver from the temple. You know that story? You do know it. It comes up many times. But you can imagine, the Jewish people are in Israel. They've been living there for hundreds of years. The Babylonians now take control of the country. They create siege over this holy city of Jerusalem. They start taking captives. They loot and pillage the holy temple, start stealing everything from the temple, and eventually burn the temple down to the ground. Okay? There's some people that still live there are some Jewish people that still live in Jerusalem, and there's a Jewish leader of the remaining Jewish people that live in Jerusalem. His name is Yehoiakim. And the Babylonians, who are now in control of the country, force the Jewish people to pay them a tax. So the Jewish people are they have to, like any country that was ruled by the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire had many countries under their rule, and each country had to pay a tax. So Israel, under the leadership of a man called Yehoiakim, had to collect money, and they had to pay tax. So the local kings were not very happy, and they were playing with the idea of creating a rebellion. They said, let's rebel against Babylonia. So what happened? So the Torah tells us that the Jewish king, whose name is Yehoiakim, this comes from the book of Jeremiah, and the prophet came to speak to him, and the prophet says, so said the Lord to me, make a yoke of straps and bars and place them upon your neck. So he said, God told me to create a yoke. You know what a yoke, an animal wears a yoke? That we should make a yoke made out of straps and bars. So some, whatever, almost look like a necklace. And you, the king of the Jewish people, should wear a yoke. I'm sorry, you shouldn't wear them. You should take this yoke and place them upon your neck. Yeah, you should put it on. And then send the yoke also to the other kings of the nearby countries that are planning this rebellion against the king of Babylonia. You should send it to them as well. And what should be the message when you send them the yoke? You should tell them that God says that I'm the creator of earth, and I give with my strength, I give it to whomever I please. And I have chosen, says God, to give these countries to the king of Babylonia, whose name is Nebuchadnezzar, who was a very, very evil man. And therefore, all you nations should accept his sovereignty. Understand? Understand the story? Mm-hmm. King Yehoiakim is the Jewish king of Israel. Then there are multiple countries around Israel, all with their own king. The Babylonian Empire, run by Nebuchadnezzar, conquered this whole land. And in each one of these countries, he leaves their king, but basically tells these kings of these small little countries, including Israel, you all are under my rulership. You have to pay me taxes. So at some point, all of these countries start planning a revolution against the Babylonian Empire. They're going to overthrow Nebuchadnezzar and reclaim their independence. And they want the Jewish king to be a part of this rebellion. Comes the prophet to the Jewish king Yehoiakim and says, I want you to make a yoke, which is symbolic of accepting somebody else's leadership, and send one of these yokes to each one of the other kings that are potentially planning a revolt against the king of Babylonia, and tell them that God said we shouldn't revolt against Nebuchadnezzar. We should accept his leadership, and we should allow ourselves to be under his yoke. Do you imagine? In other words, God is instructing the Jewish people that don't fight back. Accept your plight of being a nation under a foreign ruler, at least for now, and don't participate in the revolt for certain, and even send a message to the other kings that they too should not revolt against the other kings, which don't have to worry, because the end of the story, obviously, Nebuchadnezzar receives his punishment and God takes care of him. But for right then and there, Hashem sends a message to the prophet that the Jewish people and the other surrounding nations are to accept the fact that they are now under the dominion of King Nebuchadnezzar from the Babylonian Empire. And as a sign of that, he wants King Yehoiakim, the Jewish king, to wear a yoke. That's a massive sign of not humility, but of it's almost like the lowest of the low, that a king should walk around with a yoke on his neck to show that he accepts the dominion of a non-Jewish evil king. But that's what God said. Okay? Suddenly, while this is all happening, another man appears. And the other man that appears is, his name is Hananiah ben Azur. I'm sorry. Another man appears, and the second man appears, claims to be a prophet. He's not a known prophet. The first prophecy that everybody should allow themselves to accept the rulership of Nebuchadnezzar came from a proven and tested prophet. But now a new man came and wasn't a proven prophet, and he claimed that he had a different message from God. He said, God appeared to me, and he said that I have broken the yoke of the king of Babylonia, and in 2 years from now, this man said, God told me to tell you that God is going to return all the vessels back to the temple, and Nebuchadnezzar is going to leave, and all sorts of different things, right? How they don't have to submit themselves to Nebuchadnezzar because Nebuchadnezzar's rulership is on its way out. And what did he do to kind of prove his point? He went over to the king, who was walking around with his wooden yoke, and he took off the yoke off the king's neck, and he broke it. And he said, just as I'm breaking this yoke today, so too God says that he's going to break the yoke of King Nebuchadnezzar. Following the story so far? So the Jewish people the Jewish people are confused because they basically have two contradicting prophecies. One prophecy, which nobody wants to accept because it's horrible, comes from a reputable prophet, the Jeremiah himself, who says, King Jehoiakim, accept the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar, the evil man, and walk around like a man in exile, walk around with a wooden yoke on your shoulders. And basically, this is our lot. Our lot is a lot of suffering and destruction, and we have to accept it because that's what God said. Along comes another man, Hananiah ben Azur, and says, well, I have a different prophecy. The Nebuchadnezzar has 2 more years, and that's it. God is going to destroy him and bring us all back to Jerusalem. And as a sign of that, he breaks the yoke that's on King Joachim's neck. So now the Jewish people are confused, kind of whose prophecies to be followed. So Jeremiah gets up and he says, this other man who's claiming to be a prophet prophesied the good prophecy. Well, wait and see. Let's see. In 2 years, if God returns all of the temple vessels back to the temple and so on and so forth, then we know that he's a true prophet. But if you prophesize a true prophecy, it has to come true. Don't come back and say, oh, well, I was wrong because you all sinned. Can't be. And Jeremiah went on his way and said, if you won't accept my prophecy, let's see what happens in 2 years. What do you think happened in 2 years? Nothing happened. They did not return to the Beit HaMikdash, and this other man was proven to be a false prophet. Are we clear on the story, or you need some clarity?
Well, what's strange is that when we started off talking about free choice, and you have the choice to make, whatever, good or bad, and yet here God's telling them to be subservient to Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, it seems like
Almost seems like a repeat, where God also said that we have to be subservient to Pharaoh, so to say.
okay.
So we're going to bring it back to the whole story of Pharaoh, but there's definitely some correlation. But just to recap the story, it's the end of the first temple. Israel has been conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia, and he has basically taken control of the country, taken thousands of Jews as captives, but also left a group of Jewish people in Israel, but has now control of them. So his own army ruled the streets. He left a Jewish king called Jehoiakim, and he says, you can have Israel. It's one of my territories now, and if it's one of my territories, you have to pay me a tax. The same thing is happening in many of these small little territories around the place. Waves of rebellion are, wafting through this whole area. They want to overthrow Nebuchadnezzar. And all of these other kings are kind of, who's going to join the rebellion, who's going to not? So word reaches King Jehoiakim, the Jewish king, who's also under Nebuchadnezzar, and says, hey, if we create a rebellion, will you join the rebellion? Along comes the prophet, which, before I finish the story, it's fascinating to know that in Judaism, when we lived in Israel under a temple, the form of leadership that we had was not democracy. There was no voting for a king. It was a monarchy. And it was a very strict monarchy. The king was the king, and that was it. But there was also, like we have in America, the checks and balances, so to say, where there's division of power. As much as the king was a king with wielding all power, there were other checks and balances in place. First of all, there was a court. But more than that, there was always one person that was supposed to be higher than the king. Who was that? The prophet. The prophet always was higher than the king.
Always.
Not high, well, he should have been. Not higher in terms of how he led the people, but in terms of how the king ought to behave. The king was supposed to be listening to the prophet and not the other way around. And the good kings listened to the prophets, and the bad kings did not listen to the prophet. To the point that even the king himself was appointed by the prophet, right? King David, King Saul, the first of the kings, and King David, the second of kings, they were anointed as king by the prophet. So many, many times throughout the prophets, you have this conversation between the king and the prophet. The prophet arrives at the king and says, "Hey, king, I have a message from God." And the expectation was that the king had to listen because the prophet wasn't speaking his own information. The king was speaking the message from Hashem, and as great of a king, as great of a king as you as great of a king as you might be or think you are, you ain't greater than God. So you ought to listen to Hashem. So back to our story over here. King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia, rules Israel. King Jehoiakim is the Jewish king that's the leader of the Jewish people who live in their own land but are in exile to some degree. And like I said, the winds of rebellion are blowing, and the Jewish king wants to know if he should join the rebellion or not. Along comes the prophet and says, "I have a prophecy from God. God told me to tell you that you should not join the rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar. You should accept being under the leadership of, you should accept the exile, basically, being under the rulership of Nebuchadnezzar. And as a sign of that, you should wear a physical yoke on your neck, and you should send one to the other kings of the other nations who were not Jewish, and you should tell them the same thing, that God is telling them also to accept Nebuchadnezzar's rulership, and they should take this yoke, and nobody should rebel against Nebuchadnezzar." You can imagine that nobody wanted to hear that message. Everybody, which by the way is why the prophets were often, they spoke of being mistreated, so to say, as a prophet, because the Jewish people didn't want to listen to them. That's a horrible prophecy. Along comes another man who is not a proven prophet, and he says, "I have a different prophecy." And he took the yoke off King Jehoiakim's neck and he broke it. And he said, "Just like I'm breaking your yoke today, God is going to break the yoke of King Nebuchadnezzar. And within 2 years, everything's going to be returned to the temple. And you don't have to accept the rulership, the kingship of King Nebuchadnezzar. You don't have to worry about it." Jeremiah, who was the proven prophet, says, "Okay, you're prophesizing good prophecy. Let's wait and see. Let's see if in 2 years your prophecy will come true." And then Jeremiah, who was extremely frustrated, he left. He didn't want to be a part of it. So Maimonides, who's the one kind of giving us this whole conversation, what makes a true prophet, what makes a not true prophet, he says that when Jeremiah prophesies doom, and the other man, Hananiah, foretold good, so you have these two opposing prophecies, so to say, what did Jeremiah, the true prophet, says? He says, "Okay, if my words don't materialize, that doesn't mean that I'm a false prophet, because that could just mean that the Jewish people repented. I gave a prophecy of doom. But your words, if they don't materialize, that's a sign that you are a false prophet." So in conclusion, if a prophet stands up and gives a prophecy of doom, it's possible that that prophecy won't materialize because the Jewish people repented, or they did good. They did something to avert the decree. On the other hand, if a prophet gives a prophecy of good, if that prophecy doesn't materialize, it means that that person is a false prophet. So now getting back all the way to the story of Pharaoh. When God told Abraham, he said, hey, your descendants will be slaves in the land of Egypt. That's a prophecy of doom. It's a negative matter. God says, on the trajectory, the way things are now, that's going to be a requirement for the Jewish people to go through this situation, to go through but theoretically, it's possible that even though God himself prophesied, so to say, that a negative thing was going to happen, it doesn't mean that it has to happen, right? Here we get to the kicker of all kickers. We began this class by saying, if God said something's going to happen, obviously it's going to happen. So the slavery of the Jewish people was predestined, and where was Pharaoh's choice? Remember that question? Our question at the beginning of the class was, seemingly Pharaoh didn't have free choice. God said it was going to happen. But now we're challenging the very core of that issue. Maybe, even though God said something bad is going to happen, doesn't mean it has to happen. And we just proved that to be true after a long explanation that I took you on. You see that a bad prophecy doesn't necessarily have to come true. It's possible that a prophecy of doom won't come true. So just because God said to Abraham that your children will be slaves, it doesn't, the fact that God said it was going to happen doesn't mean it has to happen. Theoretically, Pharaoh and the Egyptians could have all said no. They could have all chosen not to participate, and it wouldn't have happened. And that wouldn't mean that Abraham's dream, Abraham's prophecy was a false prophecy. It doesn't mean that what God said wasn't true, because anytime there's a prediction of evil, of bad, of negativity, it's not guaranteed to happen. A prediction of good has to happen, but a prediction of negativity doesn't have to. Right? So since what God told Abraham was a prediction of negativity, was a prediction of something bad, doesn't mean it has to happen. It's subject to change. If you read the fine print, the very fine print at the bottom, it says this prediction is subject to change. How? God predicted that the Jewish people would have to go through a tough time of slavery because he wants something out of it. There's reason why it has to happen, because of sin. It has to be a cleansing. There's reasons why the Jewish people have to go through it. So if the Jewish people make a different set of choices, then it could have changed. So at the end of the day, it was dependent. Pharaoh did have the choice to get out of it. Pharaoh could have said, hey, I'm not doing this. I'm a good guy. I'm not choosing to do bad. And then whatever it is that God needed out of these circumstances could have been potentially done in a different way. So there was no guarantee that it was going to be fulfilled. Just because God said it was going to happen doesn't mean it has to happen. The decree was thus dependent on Pharaoh's will, and he could therefore be punished for his bad choices. So, in conclusion, we asked, why did God punish the Egyptians if he himself decreed that there would be slavery? And we quoted a few answers, but the answer that we're giving now is different. The answer that we're giving in this class is that, yes, there was a decree by Hashem that the Jewish people would be slaves. But if Pharaoh would have said, hey, I'm a good guy, I am not forced to make bad choices, I am choosing not to torment the Jewish people, then he wouldn't have had to. He would not have had to. The fact that God prophesied this prophecy, as we see at great length, a prophecy of doom does not have to come true. It is not a sign. Does not mean it's a false prophecy. He could have said, hey, I'm refusing to be a bad guy. I'm not going to do it. And by doing so, he would have changed God's mind. Just as we have throughout the generations that prophets gave prophecy of doom and they never came true, because through the choice that people made, they would have made the choice. So that's the answer to the question. The answer to the question is, why is Pharaoh being punished? Because just because God said something bad is going to happen doesn't mean it's going to happen. That if it would have been good, something good that God would have prophesied, I don't know if you could say God prophesied, but if it would have been something good that Abraham experienced as a prophecy, that has to come true, because God would never go back on something good that he says. But the evil Just because God told Abraham that something bad is going to happen doesn't mean it has to happen. God could change his mind, so to say. Or the Egyptians could say, we're not participating. And then Hashem's mind could have been changed.